Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to the second week of this ongoing online course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We are focusing here on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction. This is the second week and third lecture of this ongoing course, and today we are going to study about the Paris Agreement. So, if I give you a quick recap of what we did in the previous lecture, starting from UNFCCC in this particular week, we understood why UNFCCC was created, how it was created, what its main objectives and aims were, and then leading to the Kyoto Protocol, introduction of it, the mechanisms and the amendments and successors, and we clearly mentioned that the successor to Kyoto Protocol was Paris Agreement, is Paris Agreement. So, in this lecture, taking over from Kyoto Protocol, we are going to understand what is Paris Agreement, the introduction to it, quick key points and importance of Paris Agreement, and then how Paris Agreement is actually driving climate action. So, we will quickly understand that this entire thing in this particular lecture. So, Paris Agreement, it is considered to be a landmark international accord that was adopted by nearly every nation in 2015, unlike Kyoto Protocol, where we saw that some of the biggest parties, they withdrew this, they withdrew from becoming the signatory, or they did not ratify Kyoto Protocol. But here as part of Paris Agreement, it was nearly adopted by every nation in 2015, that was the COP15 that was held in Paris. Now, the agreement, unlike Kyoto Protocol, which had a very clear mechanism to account for greenhouse gas emissions, Paris Agreement has a slightly simpler objective, which is to limit the global temperature increase in this century, that is by 2100, to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, this might seem clear target, but then how to achieve that is slightly vague, because as I said earlier, to determine that the global temperature rise is 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So, the models are working and there are thousands of parameters and indicators which are working simultaneously. So, there the means of achieving this target, this absolute goal may be vague, which is what we will see here. And this particular agreement, it includes commitments from all major emitting countries. So, irrespective of developed or developing countries, all major emitting countries to cut their climate pollution and to strengthen those commitments over time. So, unlike Kyoto Protocol, there is no distinction, there are certain distinctions, but there is no distinction between developed countries and developing countries. Everybody, all countries are required to cut down their emissions, which was not there in Kyoto Protocol earlier. If you look at the contents of the agreement, it is a very short agreement with only 16 introductory paragraphs and overall 29 articles. Another reason for that is that it is relatively a new agreement, unlike Kyoto Protocol, which had been into existence, and with every COP happening after 1997 through amendments, through additions, through addendums, more and more mechanisms and articles were added to Kyoto Protocol. So, it contains procedural articles, for example, the criteria for its entry into the force, and operational articles, for example, mitigation, adaptation and finance, that is what it discusses. So, it is a binding agreement. All those who sign it, they are bound to meet the targets, but it does not imply obligations. Its articles, they do not imply obligations. So, the targets have to be set similar to Kyoto Protocol by the country, the party itself, and it also covers most of the greenhouse emissions except the emissions due to aviation. If we look at the timelines, and since we started talking about the historical events and timelines for sustainable development for UNFCCC and even Kyoto Protocol. We have seen the timeline only up to almost 2015. Now, what happened after 2015? The major historic events, if I have to tell you, in 2015 Paris Agreement was signed. It was signed by almost all the countries of the world, and the main agenda, the prime objective of this particular agreement is to limit the global temperature rise up to 2 degrees centigrade of the pre-industrial levels. In 2016, top emission countries China and the US, they agree to ratify the Paris Agreement, Paris Accord, which was considered to be a major success for Paris Agreement, and Paris Agreement enters into force after sufficient number of countries they ratify the deal. So, there was a good number within 1 year of its proposal. So, there was a sufficient number to ratify and to bring this agreement into force, but there was a major blow when in 2017 the US administration, President Donald Trump, he announced that US is withdrawing from the Paris Accord, and it was officially notified to the UN that US is intending to pull out of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Yet the agreement moved forward, and in 2018 the signatories, they make a first voluntary assessment of their efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So, as I mentioned, even in Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, the countries had to set for their own targets voluntarily, and that is what they had to propose. In 2020, developed countries have to provide, so this was added to the Paris Agreement, that they have to provide funds to help developing countries shift to cleaner energy sources. So, while in Kyoto Protocol we had seen that there was binding on developed countries to cut their emissions, and there were flexibility mechanisms through which they could invest in developing countries in emission reduction projects. Here the developed countries are required to fund to help developing countries to shift to cleaner energy sources. So, largely investing in the cleaner energy mechanisms, and there is no buying credits for that. So, certain projects could be under the flexibility mechanisms, but here it is kind of an obligation for developed countries to fund the cleaner energy sources projects in developing countries. In 2023, signatories make first public reporting of their progress in curbing global warming, and part of it we had seen in the first lecture of this week when we were discussing about UNFCCC, and we were looking at the commitments, the targets that each individual country has set for itself, and we saw that India committed to become net zero emission by the year 2070, or China pledged to become net zero by 2060 and things like that. And it is in 2025 all the countries, all the signatories are supposed to make, so the first assessment will be made for all the signatories on how they have actually performed. So, this will be happening in 2025. Now, if we quickly summarize the differences between Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, so we already know the timeline. The difference is that Kyoto Protocol was legally binding for all the signatories to decrease GHG emissions, but Paris Agreement is not a legally binding commitment to reduce emissions and increase accountability. If we look at the overall goals, so for Kyoto Protocol we were talking about reducing the overall emissions to by 5% from 1990 levels, while here we are talking about limiting the global temperature rise by 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. In Kyoto Protocol only developed nations were bound to reduce emissions, while here all nations have been asked to reduce emissions, and in Kyoto Protocol targets were set, but no determined time frame, and here every 5 years the targets will be set and measured. So, that is the broad difference between Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, but if we look at the finer goals, so the broader goal remains limiting the increase of global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade, that is the maximum by 2100, but we have to limit it to 1.5 is what the agreement says. But along with that we also have to increase the ability to adapt to climate change, because we clearly know that climate change is already happening and the severe events, the extreme events are also occurring as far as climate change is concerned. So, we have to increase our ability to adapt. We have to make finances consistent and aligned with agreement goals. So, how those finances will flow from developed to developing countries. So, there are certain provisions within that, but unlike Kyoto Protocol, there are no flexibility mechanisms that are being discussed, but the fact remains that the carbon trading mechanisms, the platforms are already existing and they are continuing even after the Kyoto Protocol has ended. One important goal which has been clearly written in black and white is to save and increase the forest area to capture greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and while there are no definite targets that how much area should be converted or should be afforested, a general objective is to increase forest area and each individual nation is supposed to set its own target. And each country will be reviewing its performance on how it has performed on each of these goals and the targets that they set for themselves. So, again further going into the detail, we have already talked about temperatures, but if we look at financing, Paris Agreement talks about the commitment from rich countries to provide $100 billion from 2022 as a floor to start the activities, and the amount will be updated by 2025. We are not talking about the success indicators, that how successful Paris Agreement has been on each of these indicators, which we will look at later, but not all of these points are being followed fully, or the commitments that countries have set, the targets that countries have set for themselves have been met. Then we are talking about specialization. So, it asks developed countries to take the lead in reducing greenhouse gases, while developing nations are encouraged to enhance their efforts. So, that is within specialization. And as far as emission goals are concerned, the goals have been set for 2050 and the intent is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and overall there has to be a balance that has to be achieved between emissions from human activity and the amount that can be captured by the sinks. So, kind of striking a balance. And then this Paris Agreement talks about burden sharing, where it clearly mentions that developed countries must provide financial resources to help developing countries. Then the review mechanism, as I have mentioned, every 5 years there will be a review what each country has done. And then climate related losses finds a clear mention in this agreement, where vulnerable countries, they have been recognized for their need for averting, minimizing and addressing losses that have been that they have suffered due to climate change. And the funds continuing from Kyoto Protocol, climate change fund or climate loss fund. So, they have been created to fund this thing. So, some of the key points are continuing from Kyoto Protocol, they have been adapted into Paris Agreement, but slightly in a changed form. So, again there is no discussion why at all we are talking about limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We have discussed at length about the impacts that rising temperatures have on economy, on environment, on social aspects, and we very clearly know that the development is going to decline. The human population is going to decline, the flora and fauna population is going to decline, and we will all be struggling for surviving if the temperatures cross 2 degrees centigrade. So, the target is to limit it to 1.5 itself, worst case scenario by 2100 to 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels, and we very clearly know that this global warming and this climate change that we are witnessing is because of the man-made or human generated emissions, and that is what we have to reduce. We are focusing so much in the last 3 decades on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and despite so much of effort and money and time that has been put into these discussions and also setting targets, unfortunately we have yet not been able to achieve the targets or even control that or hold it to the same level. We are constantly increasing the targets. So, that is where it, while it all sounds good, but unfortunately we are nowhere close. So, if you look at this particular graphics, the targets that the countries have set for themselves, if they are able to fulfill all those targets, even then we are going to reach a 3-degree rise, is what our models tell us, which clearly tells us that the targets that countries have set for themselves are not enough. We need to set stricter, more stringent targets, more challenging targets to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is if we are doing our best in achieving what we want to achieve, we will be at 3 degrees centigrade. If we are not able to achieve the targets that we have set, we will be somewhere 3.5 degrees centigrade. Currently, we are here at 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and the upper limit that has been set by Paris Agreement is here. Look at the gap. It clearly tells us that we need to ramp up our efforts. The entire world needs to ramp up the efforts in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But Paris Agreement is actually a successful agreement in the sense that it is driving a lot of action across the world. One good thing is that it has brought almost all the world together. A large part of the world is actually a party to the Paris Agreement. So, if we look at the different actions that are taking place with regard to climate action. So, for example, talking about the fossil fuels. So, it was adopted in December 2015, and from then on, if we see several new policies, different countries, they have been, whether they have ratified Paris Agreement or not, but they are bringing out stricter policies. For example, US halted the issue of new coal mining leases on federal lands. It stopped the assigning leases for mining coal. JP Morgan stops direct finances of new coal mines. Saudi Arabia, which is a country which is known for running its economy on oil, is planning for a non-oil economy. Quarter of European countries, they quit coal. UK energy from coal falls to zero for the first time in over a century, and we are talking about countries declaring no burning of fossil fuel for a period such as 2 months, and major financial institutions, they stop financing coal fired power plants and projects like these which are polluting. So, gradually more and more countries are working on policies where they are directly reducing the emissions. They are stopping funding of projects which will require burning of fossil fuels such as coal. If we are talking about renewable, because on one side we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but we do not have to compromise on the quality of life and development by reducing the amount of energy that is available. So, the option is one, to reduce the conventional fuel consumption, and the other one is to fund the renewable sources of energy. So, again here for the first time we saw that clean energy investment, it reached 329 billion US dollars. There is a lot of economic boost in Israel from carbon cuts, more electric car charge points than gas stations in Japan. So, we are shifting to cleaner fuels. Canada, US and Mexico, they agree to generate half of the electricity from clean sources by 2025. So, this was adopted as a target. US completes first offshore wind farm. So, there is a lot of investment and push into renewable sources of energy, wind, solar, hydro, so biofuels. So, we are seeing a lot of push that is there on shifting to renewable energy. India, as we saw in the first lecture of this week, has pledged to promote green hydrogen as a fuel, and a lot of research is being funded on green hydrogen. So, all countries gradually are talking about shifting to renewable sources of energy. If we look at investment and finance, we clearly see that the carbon trade is expanding. So, there are industries, there are emitters who are reducing their carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and they are taking the savings to the international market and trading them to make an economic sense of this entire activity. There are carbon taxes that are being levied. the oil industry, which is a polluting industry as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned, they are facing investor debt spiral. So, not enough investments are being received by the oil industry, while on the contrary renewable energy investments expands to twice that of coal and gas. So, this is on investment and finance. What kind of projects are being financed? That is also being driven by what we have set, what we have agreed as part of the Paris Agreement. On divestment, here we are talking about coal divestment, we are talking about divesting fully from fossil fuels. So, we are investing in renewables and we are divesting from the projects which are emitters, GHG emitters, which are talking about the fossil fuels. And so, we are looking at a shift of investment from the conventional fuel or fossil fuel based projects to renewable energy based fuels. So, Paris Agreement in this regard is driving a lot of action on the climate change front and directly, if I say, on greenhouse gas emission front. So, with this I hope that we are very clear about how it all started and how it is gradually going forward. Currently Paris Agreement is in force and we will talk about IPCC and greenhouse gas protocol, and we will also understand how the carbon credits are calculated, how they are earned, and all of that mechanism in the coming few lectures and coming few weeks. So, thank you very much for joining with me in this lecture today. See you tomorrow in lecture 4 of this week. Bye bye.